I'm Mike Papantonio, and this is Ring of Fire. American citizens are painfully ignorant about the majority of issues that affect their day-to-day lives. Ring of Fire co-host Sam Seder is going to join us to talk about whether Americans are actually too stupid for democracy. Corporate America is trying to sell us the idea that government regulations are killing our economy. We'll be exposing all of the anti-regulation talking points. And a proposed trade deal could give American corporations even more power than our federal government. We'll bring you the details. That's all coming up, but right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
As incredible as it might seem, the average American can't name a single Supreme Court justice. They can't pass a U.S. citizenship test, and they become more likely to believe in tinfoil hat conspiracy theories than in global climate change. All of this makes you wonder if Americans have become too stupid for democracy. I've got Ring of Fire co-host Sam Seder with me now to talk about that very point. So Sam, the American public, you're seeing these articles. Have they become too stupid to actually involve themselves with democracy? Those articles are showing up everywhere because of so many studies that are coming up that are just talking about how uninformed American voters are.
Yeah, it's true, Pap. I mean, we're seeing it ranges not just in terms of voters, it's also the case with representatives, but we're seeing it across different issues. We've always talked about the surveys in the past that have shown an incredibly large amount of Americans don't even know who the vice president is. But in other areas, it's not just sort of general knowledge that's problematic. In the gun debate, for instance, they did some polling on whether or not people perceive that our gun laws need to be made more strict, or whether or not there needs to be more enforcement of the existing gun laws. And Americans, more or less the majority of Americans, say enforce the existing gun laws. Well, they took a further survey to see exactly if those people knew what the gun laws were. And it turns out, of course, that no, they were shocked to find out that the gun laws did not include things like universal background checks, or that high-capacity magazines weren't already outlawed. So this is a problem, and I think it's a problem that we can see ultimately as a function of our media.
Okay, so but you started at your point about, for example, that I think the number is that 1 in 3 Americans aren't even able to tell you who the Vice President of the United States is. Now, add to that the fact that, again, this is not just based on casual observations of looking at the literature. The studies are very clear on this. They did an incredible study that compared the level of information in the UK from how much does a British citizen know, what do they know in Denmark, what do they know in Finland. And for example, in the UK, they had about a 60% understanding of what was going on internationally. I think the Scandinavian countries is about a 70%. America was less than 40%, but let's give it 40%. Now that was on international. On domestic, it wasn't any better, where you would ask them, well, what's happening domestically? What are the important cases, the important stories that you need to follow? They don't know, but nevertheless, they feel like they know, don't they, Sam?
Well, yeah, I mean, and more often than not, people who are incompetent at certain tasks completely overestimate their competence. And we see this in the context of our debates all the time in this country. We take phone calls from listeners at times, and some of those libertarians call in. They're absolutely sure. They know exactly what they're talking about. These conservatives know exactly what they're talking about, but at the end of the day, they really don't even know some of the most basic rudimentary facts in which they're arguing. So yeah, this is a real big problem because, for instance, right now in this country, we're going through essentially a period of austerity because of the sequester. Only 6% of the American public are aware that President Obama has halved the budget deficit, that we have shrunk our government spending to levels that we haven't seen since the Eisenhower administration. Yet, we see time and time again polls showing that the size of the deficit, the size of the debt is supposedly very important to Americans, yet they don't realize that it has been halved over the past 4 years. And so this is highly problematic because if you have a population out there that wants a certain outcome but isn't aware that we've already achieved that outcome, it leaves politicians with having to chase essentially a ghost.
Well, first of all, you had less than 20% of the American public that even if you asked them what is sequester, they couldn't even tell you what it was. And one of the most important issues that were coming out, they didn't even know what it was. But I think what you were talking about earlier there's the Dunning-Kruger story, the Dunning-Kruger study. This is a well-known study right now because it's led to about a half a dozen other stories that have studies that have supported the same thing. And the Dunning-Kruger study showed that people, I mean, if you drill down, it is that people are too stupid to know that they're stupid. I mean, if you really analyze what Dunning-Kruger had to say, it is they have such little information and such little self-awareness about what they know that they don't even understand that they don't know. And when the studies were performed, a couple of studies that came out of Germany after Dunning-Kruger said it's not only that they don't know, it is that they believe and they talk themselves into believing that they know more than the person who actually has the information. So these studies are remarkable, and it's remarkably scary to me when you think of democracy has to rely on people having information, right, Sam?
Yeah, of course. And, you know, we see this type of skepticism of scientists as well. You know, the notion that someone can make an assessment as to whether or not there is global warming in the world based upon them looking out their window and saying, well, it snowed here last night. So clearly these scientists are full of it. And, you know, this has also been frankly, a long-term project of the right to undercut things like science, undercut the notion of some type of empiricism, because you know, this is you cannot defer to scientists in this situation if your agenda is to continue to poison the planet, for instance. It also, you know, puts the realm of conversation more into an area of morality as opposed to what functions best for society. And so this has been a long-term agenda. But yes, it's very problematic that human beings have this tendency to sort of assume that their knowledge is greater than that of certain experts at times.
Well, when some other studies that have come out that I just think are remarkable is when you ask, they were trying to figure out why is it that the average American would agree that there's something particularly bad about inheritance taxes. Why should the average American care at all about inheritance taxes? Because most of the time, I mean, almost exclusively, you've got inheritance taxes that hit a crowd well above $1 million a year. I mean, it's not just.
Oh yeah, we're talking about literally 0.03% of the population.
Exactly. But nevertheless, the average person out there believes that it's in their best interest to side up with these billionaires and multimillionaires, and this is extraordinary. But they asked people who were actually on Social Security. In other words, their productive years were behind them. They were on Social Security. There was really, as a practical matter, no way that they were going to move into that crowd, that exclusive 1% crowd. But they believed, and they said that they were voting to do away with inheritance taxes because they believed it would affect their life, that they could become a millionaire, that they could move into that 1%. So it's that lack of self-awareness right along with just pure out stupidity. I mean, you've got stupidity to the result. They're not even aware of the fact that they're stupid.
Well, you know, it cuts both ways too on that, Pat, because if you ask any American whether or not they're middle class, there will be an assumption that they are middle class. But even if you're in the top 5% of all earners, you are more likely to consider yourself middle class. And obviously, if you're in the top 5% of all earners, you're clearly not. There's been a lot of studies in terms of whether or not people think the rich should pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. And the majority of people believe that's the case. However, those same people, if they don't recognize that they are in fact those very wealthy people that they think taxes should be raised upon, yet they perceive their own taxes to be too high. And so, yeah, I mean, it's very convenient, of course, but people, you're right. And look, there's been study after study that has compared the amount of income inequality that we have in this country versus how people perceive what kind of income inequality we should have versus what kind of income inequality there is. And so Americans have a notion that there should be a certain amount of income inequality in this country. They perceive it to be less than they think it is. And what they think it is actually far less than what it actually is.
Sam, we used to be able to blame Fox News for all this. We could say Fox News was responsible because the average person who watched Fox News believed there was some connection between weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They really believed that the wrong people were involved in the process. But we can't blame just Fox News anymore, can we? I mean, these studies are showing it is an epidemic of stupidity where it comes to what's real in this country. In about a minute, give me your observation on that.
Well, I mean, we can't just blame Fox News. I mean, frankly, we've got to blame all of our news. There's very few outlets now that aren't more focused on some type of sort of fluff. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the population in this country is more apt to know more about the latest of housewives in New Jersey or the latest reality show than they are about the functioning of our government. And so the problem is not just Fox News, although they certainly do their best to provide misinformation. But the problem is that we have too much pursuit of corporate profits in our media. And it comes at the expense of genuine reporting. It comes at the expense of an editorial control that says these things are genuinely important, as opposed to analyzing what's happened in people's favorite TV show or fictional show. And so that's really the problem, is that we need to have some type of civic-minded media that informs people instead of just entertains them.
Fat chance we'll ever have that because the money's just too big. Sam Seder, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Pat.
Just ahead, we'll be talking about the GOP's plan to change the face of government on a state-by-state basis. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back.
Stand up.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The Republican Party has figured out that they don't need to hold power in the federal government to change the political landscape. Instead, they're using their power in state legislatures to remake this country. Joining me now to talk about the Republican state strategy are attorneys Howard Nations and Mike Burg. Mike, if you listen to the Beltway politicians talk about the fact of how bad how bad the Republicans are having it right now, because the studies are coming out, their own reviews are coming out, their own polls are coming out, and it's making it look, if you take a look at those studies, it looks like the Republicans are just almost a party of the past. But what they've been doing is they realize they can't win on a national election, so they're building in the states. They're going state by state and building a new approach, aren't they, Mike?
They sure are. In fact, I think it's important the public understand that they have 30 states in which they have a Republican governor in the mansion, and they control 26 state legislatures completely. And the agenda of the right wing is there and present in all those states. And what they're doing is they're trying to get their legislation, taking away women's rights, going, you know, we had a crazy decision recently from the legislature of Kansas saying that conception, at conception life begins. Waiting right now for the governor to sign that in Kansas. This is just one example, and people have to be aware of what's going on in the state legislatures and in the governor's mansion.
So, Howard, a couple of weeks ago, of course, you and I did a segment on the autopsy report that came from the Republicans, and then we said, you know, from a national standpoint, the Republicans are in trouble. They've known it for a long time. And so while the Democrats have ignored what Howard Dean told them to do, which is to build out a 50-state strategy, the Republicans have stepped in there, and they're killing us in the states, aren't they?
I think the Democratic victory dance is a little premature, because the fact of the matter is the Republicans are winning overwhelmingly in the states. They control 30 state legislatures. They're working together through the American Legislative Exchange Council to pass the same bad legislation for us all over the United States, and for the rights of our consumers and the people that we represent. They have the House to block Obama. But another thing that they have that you can't ever underestimate the power of is the United States Supreme Court. They're 5-4 in the United States Supreme Court, and they're very powerful there. Now,
and what, Howard, what that really means is we can legislate in Washington all we want. I mean, you can come up with all the legislation you want in Washington, in the Beltway, but if a state legislature, Alabama, Mississippi, whatever, comes up with some horrendous law, it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The neocons win there too. How is it, Mike, let me jump over to you. How is it that the Democrats have missed this trend? I mean, we know that Howard Nations said years ago, he said, you know what, we can do everything you want to in the Beltway, but if you don't have control of the states, Republicans are going to win every time. Howard Dean said that again and again, and we've ignored it. So where does this leave us?
Well, let me tell you, and I think Howard makes a good appointment about ALEC, the American Legal Exchange Council. They're even in the municipal and the counties here in Colorado. We have a Democratic-controlled legislature and a Democratic governor and 2 U.S. senators that are Democratic, but they're putting money into the local. We have a Douglas County that's trying to change the way school is funded, and they're getting the money from ALEC. So the Democrats have been sleeping. They've been sleeping, and they've been thinking only in a national sense. They've got to raise money at the local level, at the state level, and they have to make sure that ALEC and other right-wing lobbyist organizations are not getting into the local scene and basically overpowering the Democrats.
Right. But Howard, isn't part of the problem that it's that narcissism that exists within the Beltway? The media, for example, corporate media is nothing but Beltway corporate media. They hardly even report on what's happening in the states. And so you hear these stories like Michael just talked about that takes place in Kansas. It'll be some harebrained legislation that comes out of a place like Florida or Alabama, Mississippi, where they're changing the right to vote. Could be anything. But the Beltway media, corporate media, thinks that all that's important is what happens on the Sunday talk shows.
Mike, I think that politics is like an iceberg. The 10% that you see above the water is Washington, D.C. The 90% of what's going on actually in politics is in the rest of the country. Same-sex marriage, abortion, education, spending, labor unions, even Obamacare now. It's all being handled by state legislatures. Not anything's being done now at the federal level, and more importantly, that once the states handle this, it's then tested by the Supreme Court of the United States, which again is 5-4 Republican.
So let me go to you, Mike, on this. You mentioned earlier that the fact that you have Republicans controlling the governor's mansion, but they also control the state houses. I mean, if you take a look at the numbers, I think it's 30 out of 50 of the state houses are controlled by Republicans. You have about 18 legislatures controlled by Democrats. So this didn't just happen overnight. What you have is lobbyists going to states to try to change politics these days because they know they're controlling politics in state houses. So if you take a look at Obamacare, what they love to call Obamacare, which is a reform that's so important, we go state by state where there's Republican governors, Republican legislatures, and we see what they're doing to that federal legislation that came from the Beltway, right?
Absolutely, and the Supreme Court opened the door with their decision. Everyone said, again, on a global level, that Obamacare was decided in favor of Obamacare, but it allows the states to either opt in or not opt in with regard to the expansion of Medicaid. And the Republican states, they're not doing that, even to the detriment of their own citizens. Each state will be able to decide those things. Look what happened in Wisconsin, where the money was put into that thing with regard to Walker to break the union. With the Medicaid expansion, it's hurting the people of that state, but the Republicans have an agenda and they're going to stick to it.
So, Howard, haven't the Republicans gotten to the point at this stage where they almost laugh at the importance of controlling the White House? And if you really think about it, if they're gerrymandering in the states, that's allowing them to control the House. They don't worry about the Senate. They control the House. They accomplish state legislation that supersedes anything they try to do on a federal level. And at this point, I don't really see how you can take health care reform and have it really have any kind of meaningful impact, because the states that are going to line up neocon Republican are going to stop it.
Well, all politics is local. And that is shown very clearly here, where state legislatures control the gerrymandering. The gerrymandering produces the Congress, or the House at least, and the House stops whatever the president's trying to do for the most part. And everything else is handled at state level. And right now the states are rejecting Obamacare, the very states that need it most. Ironically, the states where you have the largest number of low-income people, you have the largest number of people with the worst health habits. They have the obesity, the drinking, the smoking, all the problems that go along with that. Those are the very same states that are going out of their way to reject Obamacare by rejecting the Medicaid that they have the option to sign on to.
Michael Burg, we saw one way that the Republicans are using the states just this last election cycle. We saw them trying to engage in voter purges, where they made it virtually impossible for people to vote, ID cards, which were nothing but a scam to keep people away from the polls. They had the governors and the state legislatures that were actually closing down traditional polling places. They were underfinancing the polling process. They were understaffing the process to where people in certain jurisdictions or certain voting areas had lines that sometimes lasted 4 to 8 hours. And so don't they come at us another way once they control that governorship, once they control that legislature? Don't they simply come at their policy changes that way?
Absolutely. And in fact, that change from the bottom up, from the legislative Ohio, which closed the lines down, they had 8-hour lines. What that does affect even the national election, because what they do, it discourages voting. They're taking rights away from the voter. Mike and Howard, I must tell you, and the people out there have to understand, it's going to take money from the DNC and from the Democrats to change the way they think. They have to think about the local level and work their way up in order to make sure that everyone's rights are protected.
Well, that is it, Howard. That is exactly what Howard Dean talked about, and when he talked about it, it was like you had all these smart guys, you know, up in the Beltway, these smart boys with MBAs, and you know they were political strategists. They laughed at Howard Dean and they said, no, if we control the White House, then we control everything. Well, the bad news that the smart boys didn't understand is the smart boys never took a damn civics class, and they never understood that up in Washington, you can write all the laws you want, but if the federal court takes it away, in the way it starts in the state court. State court takes the right away, goes to the federal court, that federal court takes it away, and ultimately it gets to the Supreme Court, and they take it away. Because Howard Dean was right, you have to start from the bottom up.
Howard Dean's 50-state strategy was brilliant. It was rejected. It was replaced in the Democratic Party by two things. First, by the Clinton machine, and then by the Obama machine. Now, the Clinton machine was very successful in electing a president. The Obama machine was very successful in electing a president. It's all about D.C. But as we've talked here this morning, the entire situation with respect to the overall picture starts from the state legislatures, and that's where most of the laws in this country are being passed today.
And Michael, isn't the real stinger here is that we have a president that doesn't understand. I swear to God, he does not understand that the federal courts can just they can absolutely destroy everything he tries to do. His appointments to the federal court have been horrendous, haven't they?
Well, they have it for the consumers. These are not consumer advocates. You would hope that Obama would understand enough about that it's important. You got to have federal judges, especially at the Court of Appeals, but even at the trial level, who understand what's going on with consumers in this country. He doesn't understand that. He hasn't made the appointments, and the appointments he's made overall haven't been very good for the consumer and for the people in this country who want to maintain their rights.
He's always, Howard, in about 10 seconds, he simply doesn't understand the policy connections, does he?
Well, he doesn't understand the policy connections, and the big problem now is not just who he's appointing, but the fact that he's not filling those appointments. If he gets 2 years into this term and he hasn't filled all those federal vacancies, they'll be held up.
Howard Nations, Michael Burg, as usual, thanks for giving us the information. We'll be back next week. When we come back, we'll tackle the myths that corporate America is pushing to sell the idea of deregulation. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Wall Street wants us to believe that government regulations are crippling our economy. But the truth is that our economy always does better when we have strong protections in place to keep Wall Street bankers accountable and honest. Joining me now to talk about the deregulation lies of Wall Street is attorney James Kauffman. James, you know, Taylor Lincoln did a great work with his book called Reality Check, where he talks about the history of deregulation in the country and how we have such little understanding about how much damage it's done to this country. And I think one thing he points out is that every time we hear deregulation, you have the Chamber of Commerce, you have Wall Street start saying, oh my God, if you do that, the sky is going to fall. You're going to have frogs dropping out of the sky. You're going to have the rivers running red with blood. We're going to get boils all over our body. It's just going to be bad. That is a story that is told again and again. It's a lie that's told again and again by Wall Street and the Chamber of Commerce, isn't it?
Yes, and that's where Wall Street's incentive is, because for the history since the Great Depression till now, Wall Street has always maintained that you don't need to regulate us. We police ourselves, supposedly, but meanwhile the SEC's understaffed. There's rampant corporate fraud that goes completely unchecked. No one ends up going to jail. And what Taylor Lincoln does in his book is explain the fact that deregulation actually is what causes our economy to become derailed. And
okay,
really Yeah.
I remember, James, you know, if you go back and you look at the history books, I remember reading again and again, in 1933, you had 4,000 banks that went under, okay? 4,000
Yes.
banks. They went under because of the same thing that we see happening today, Wall Street greed, Wall Street criminals in control of politics, in control of politics, Wall Street criminals in charge of capitalism. So
Yes.
in 33, you have 4,000 banks that go under. 1934, we come in with the FDIC, come in with things like Glass-Steagall that changes things, and you have 52 banks that failed after that. And so this argument that was being made by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce back then is, gee whiz, if you have FDIC, you have something that looks like Glass-Steagall, we're all going to be out of business. The economy is going to crumble, democracy is going to be at an end, and things will never be the same. Those were the arguments, the same arguments we hear today, aren't they?
It's the same arguments we're hearing today, and it's the same problems that we had back in the Depression that we're having in the latest financial crisis. All of those checks that were put in place back in 33, 34, Glass-Steagall, the Security and Exchange Act, the Securities Act, all of those were put in place to try to level the playing field and to put Wall Street kind of in check, really, to right some of the wrongs, to put the light on some of the there's really two different streets. There's Main Street and Wall Street. Wall Street.
So in Wall Street, though, for the last, and it continues with this administration, there's no better with this administration.
Yes.
Wall Street is in control of this presidency. And so what Wall Street does to appeal to Main Street is they tell mom and pop business owner, they tell mom and pop investors, gee, if you go forward with something like Dodd-Frank, if you go forward with Sarbanes-Oxley, which has some control over what Wall Street is doing, then the whole process will crumble. You will lose your pension program, and you will lose jobs because of it. Nothing is farther from the truth, but corporate media doesn't seem to have the ability to explain that to the American people, do they?
Yeah, it's corporate fear-mongering is really what it is, Mike. It is corporate America and Wall Street trying to scare Main Street and Middle America into thinking that these regulations will cause you to lose your job, that it will cause the economy to tank, it'll cause your retirement to dry up. Meanwhile, what Wall Street does is they take risks with people's money. They take risk with mom and pop investment pension funds and retirement funds, take unmitigated risks with those funds, and then we have things like 2007, 2008, 2009. We have some of the worst times of our economy because of the fact that they go unchecked. And that is just something that Wall Street doesn't want anyone to wake up about. They don't want anyone to be upset about or raise a noise about because they make money at it.
And they're getting plenty cooperation from corporate media who seems to want the same thing. What it does is it destroys stability in this country. If you go back and look at the stories that were done on Sarbanes-Oxley, for example,
sure.
Go back and look at the stories that you had corporate media do on Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, this is a case that simply says that after the failure of Enron, after the failure of WorldCom, Sarbanes-Oxley says, look, those things failed because you had corporate CEOs that were phoning up the documents. They were making up complete lies where it came to their financial structure, and it caused those companies to fail. So Sarbanes-Oxley says we need some transparency, and when a CEO agrees that when he signs off on that, he's agreeing that he's telling the truth. Now, from a common sense standpoint and from a standpoint of somebody who does what you do as a living, for a living, doesn't this make perfect sense to tell the truth?
It makes perfect sense to tell the truth. And the other thing that shocks me is that time and time again we get this Wall Street can police itself mentality. We get Wall Street does everything right. Well, frankly, Wall Street is about one thing, and that's money and greed. And really, Wall Street is out for themselves. They don't care about the regular investor. They don't care about retirement. They don't care about retirees. They don't care about any of that. They care about their bottom line and making money. The worst thing, one of the worst statistics out there is that during the financial crisis, all of your major banks made money during that period of time. They all profited from it. You have JP Morgan saying recently that they actually profit from downturns. They make money. And frankly, sometimes Wall Street can be a zero-sum game. That means they win, other people lose. Well, guess who's going to lose?
They gave out $40 billion in CEO structured payment and bonuses during the time that taxpayers were paying this money. Explain Dodd-Frank. Now, you have the Chamber of Commerce saying, oh my God, if we have Dodd-Frank, this is going to be awful. It's going to be a disaster. Capitalism's going to fail. We're going to lose jobs. Explain the simplicity of Dodd-Frank.
The simplicity of Dodd-Frank was just to put in some of the, or put back in to our regulations some of the teeth of what was there for corporate wrongdoing and for just explaining out some of the issues with, for instance, Glass-Steagall. Part of Dodd-Frank is to put back in the Volcker Rule. Now, the Volcker Rule puts in place that, for instance, banks, commercial banks can't lend proprietary or can't trade proprietary derivatives or anything like that in their own account. They used to do that, and that's what caused the problems with CDOs and whatnot. It takes out some of that. And it also restricts some of the banks as far as some of the risks that they can take. And it also puts in some teeth for the same type of thing, enforcement. Exactly, the same things that if there is lies, if there are CEOs that aren't telling the truth, if there are regulations, or if there are filings that aren't truthful, Dodd-Frank allows the SEC to go after them for it.
Well, we know with this administration, they can steal all they want. Nobody will go to jail. But at least there are some places where they at least have to pay money sometimes. So look, when we heard when we saw the Wall Street crowd take our money by way of CDOs and synthetics and swaps and all of these mortgage frauds that they had going on, after everything burned down, after it was very evident that Wall Street was just a gaggle of criminals stealing from the American public, the argument that we heard coming from the Chamber of Commerce was, well, gee whiz, you know, this wasn't the fault of, this was not the fault of Wall Street. This was the fault of the administration because they had allowed the Community Reinvestment Act to take place, and they were trying to sell homes to people who couldn't afford it. Tell us how crazy and how wrong that argument was.
That argument is completely wrong. They're saying that basically that act went ahead and encouraged lenders to well, you know, we went out and issued these loans, and it's on the mortgage servicers or the mortgage producers that they're the ones that caused all the problem because they went and gathered the loans. Well, guess what? You wouldn't have the demand for the loans if the banks weren't saying, give me more investors to put into CDOs, give me more mortgage-backed securities, give me more of that. There was a demand. The banks buy those, they package up those loans, and they sell them off as securities, as CDOs and mortgage. And if you
James,
didn't have the demand, it wouldn't have happened.
James, what we saw though is this this Community Reinvestment Act that was put forward by the government. If you looked at the percentage of failures under that act, it was only 6%. If you look at the failures that fell outside of that act, it was 94%. But nevertheless, the media, corporate media, still bought into this idea of what they were being told by Wall Street, what they were being told by the Chamber of Commerce. I not one time saw a reporter on corporate media that said, you know what, we looked at the numbers and there was only a 6% failure in the Community Reinvestment Act where loans were made, and there was a 96% failure for all of the CDOs and the synthetics and the swaps that took place outside of that act. Is it simply because the media, this is too complicated for the media?
No, it's certainly not too complicated for the media. They all can look at the same thing that a lot of other people look at and figure those same default rates out. The difference is that the media needs something to grapple onto that will explain this away, so to speak, of why it failed. I mean, really, it's not on the Wall Street banks because it's the mortgage servicer. Well, it's not the mortgage servicer, it's because the person wanted the loan. There's always a passing of the blame, and they use things like the Community Reinvestment Act to try to deflect and try to distract everyone from the real problem, which in this case was Wall Street greed.
James, we saw actually legislation that was introduced by representatives that said, you know what, we need legislation that says that we need to prevent lenders from issuing loans to borrowers who don't have the ability to pay the loan back. Doesn't that make perfect sense? I mean, anybody hearing that could say, gee whiz, yeah, I don't have any trouble with that, but what happened with it?
Well, it doesn't make perfect sense. I mean, lenders are supposed to have criteria, and one of those basic criteria that anyone could figure out is you're supposed to be able to have the means to pay back a loan. That's what the bank is supposed to look at. But what happened to that bill that you're talking about? It was killed in I believe in the House, and that bill did not make it to light. It's being held up. And it's absolutely perfect sense legislation, but it doesn't happen because of a political agenda, and it doesn't happen because whatever political party doesn't want it to come to light.
Well, and the truth is nothing will ever change. Wall Street will continue stealing from us. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce will continue lying to us unless two things happen, unless corporate media starts telling the truth about what's really going on, and unless we have an administration that are willing to put people in jail for the type of conduct that we've been talking about here. Thanks for joining me, James. Again, Taylor Lincoln did a great job with this. It's a book people should read.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll discuss a new trade proposal that would give corporations unprecedented power over our government. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Stand up, stand up.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Corporations are pushing the Obama administration to approve a trade deal that they claim is going to help this economy. But what would really happen is that corporations would be given a free pass to ignore federal rules. Joining me now to talk about this disaster of a trade pact is attorney Joe Cotchett. Joe, the investor-state resolution, it's almost become the point to where it's no surprise that you would have the Obama administration supporting such a thing. And it simply is a way to take power away from state and U.S. government courts and give it to corporations, isn't it?
Well, first of all, the name investor-state resolution is all nonsense. It's really multi-nation corporations that want to dominate other countries. This word investor it makes it sound like it's some innocent shareholders, some innocent investors. Has nothing to do with investors. So that nomenclature is put in there or used just to mislead people. It's about multinational corporations that don't want to abide by U.S. laws, Canadian laws, EU laws. And that's the simple language here. And the Obama administration is playing right into it.
Joe, is it that this administration has always surrounded itself with the corporate types? I mean, from day one, we started seeing Geithner and Sumners, and we saw the whole Wall Street crowd influencing every important decision that this president was making. I've not seen any relief from that. As a matter of fact, we now see that he has Biden out during the election campaign telling people that they're not going to cut Social Security, saying, listen, he said it again and again, we're not going to cut Social Security. Corporations tell him, we like the idea of you cutting Social Security. So he comes out now with this talking point, we're going to cut Social Security. Do the corporations just have such control of this president we can't expect more?
That's a tragedy. Actually, I don't think it's Obama or Biden. I think it's truly the system with which now pervades Washington. I think it's K Street. I think it's Wall Street. I don't think Obama and Biden have a lot of say in policy direction anymore. The people that he brought in initially were horrible. You know that. The American public now knows that. Most of them are gone, but their policies linger on because following them come their protégés. They walk in the door and they pronounce those same policies. So let me get right to that. We've got to change the way Washington works. Obama can't change it. Joe Biden can't change it. They're surrounded by people that come off, I keep using the phrase Wall Street, and that's the critical message, because the message has to be, it is about Main Street, not Wall Street. It is about the people in this country that really care about their surroundings, and they're on Main Street.
And so this investor state resolution is another example of what you're talking about, Joe, isn't it? You've got corporations that are saying to court systems, for example, in Canada, they say, we don't like your laws here in Canada, and because of these trade agreements that we have in place, we're not going to abide by your laws. As a matter of fact, we're going to take you to court and make you change your laws. So when a state or a nation has laws that protect the environment, and the corporation doesn't like that, they say we're not going to follow that law. Or whether it's defective drug issues, whether it's Exxon Mobil wanting to frack or drill for oil, if the corporation says we don't like your laws, and therefore we're going to take it directly to the WTO courts, the World Trade Organization courts, and we're not going to let your sovereign decide this. We're going to have corporate types decide this. How much in line can Obama possibly allow the corporations to get where it comes to controlling our court systems even?
Well, it's not only the court system. You put your finger right on it. Let's use ExxonMobil as the great example you just used. Canada did not like the fact that they were fracking oil and creating toxic waste water dumps, literally, and had regulations in place that they attacked. But it's not only the oil companies, it's Big Pharma. A great example of that is the decision that just came down in the India Supreme Court a week ago, where they told Novartis, a multinational Big Pharma, that they couldn't continue selling their drugs, or that is to say, block out the cancer drugs that were of a generic form. Now, that is one good example of where Big Pharma is pushing for a world court. They don't want the India court deciding that, whether or not they can block out generic drugs. They don't want the U.S. courts blocking that. They don't want U.S. courts telling them what environmental regulations they can do, nor do they want Canada doing that. This is all about multinational corporations setting up their own court system worldwide, given a, quote, free trade agreement. What nonsense that is. There is no free trade. It's all about their dominating how they can get around sovereign nations' laws.
So in the United States, you have the Republicans that they undertook tort reform, for example, in America. They want to close the door to people who have claims, consumers who have claims. They don't want to close the door to corporations who have claims. They want to close the door to consumers who have claims. So now what this idea, this Obama idea, I can't get away from the idea, this is an Obama presidency who is pushing this concept of investor state resolution, and that is to do exactly what you've just described. So here we have a setting, Joe, where they get the chance to change, they change the laws by ignoring the laws, basically. They say, we don't need tort reform in the United States. We're simply going to change people's rights to make claims all over the world. Isn't that what's happening? This
That's
single
exactly
court
correct.
system?
As a matter of fact, that's exactly correct. As a matter of fact, Eli Lilly's spokesmen have all but said that. Many of these great big pharmas, which are multinational corporations, have said to Wall Street, we are going to change the environment in which we operate. We're not going to abide by some court in Chicago, in San Francisco, or in Florida telling us environmentally what we can do or what we can sell. That's the problem that the Obama administration has to come to grips with. It hasn't in its first 4 years because it was very difficult, Mike. It's all about that re-election situation, and it's all about the money that flows into Washington that allows it.
Don't we somehow we have to be able to say to a candidate that's running. Now understand, again, let me put this in terms of what's happening domestically, because it's an exact reflection of this story that we're talking about internationally. But domestically, you had the Obama administration, while he was running, have his vice presidential candidate, Joe Biden, say on at least a dozen occasions, look at a camera and say on a dozen occasions, we're not going to tamper with Social Security at all, made the promise. It sounded just like the time that Senior Bush said, read my lips, no new taxes. But the first thing we see happening now is Obama being gobbled up by Wall Street again on the Social Security issue. They hate Social Security. They want to privatize Social Security. And so the corporations are involved in dominating what this president does domestically. And now we see they're obviously dominating what he does internationally with this investor state resolution, which will destroy the right for a sovereign to use their own courts to determine political and social policy. Am I missing something here, Joe? Please correct it if I am.
You are missing nothing. You are missing nothing. In fact, you used a key word there, which is privatize. Let me emphasize let me just enlarge upon what you just said. Wall Street wants to privatize Medicare, Medi-Cal, every medical delivery device or services in the country because there is a profit to be made by privatizing it. Now, what's happened is, I want to come to the defense of the Obama-Biden administration. What's happened is there is gridlock in the U.S. Senate. There is no gridlock over in the House because the Republicans and Wall Street, remember this, Wall Street controls that House. They elect those people. They also elect enough Republicans in the Senate to block any reform we want to make. Listen, our senior citizens have to rely upon Medicare. It can't be changed. But there is a voice out there, the word you use, privatize, to private, put it in the hands of private companies where they can make profits. And by the way, if you saw the executive salaries that came out in healthcare just released in Sunday's New York Times, the CEOs of these, quote, healthcare operations are making anywhere from $20 to $30 million a year profit, and they want to increase that under the new Obamacare, if you will, by privatizing much of this health service deliveries.
Okay,
unfortunately, no, by the way, let me just add one thing. You know, the doctors and the nurses are the people that are going to suffer, not only the consumers.
But Joe, the important the important point that you're making here ties back into this story of investor state resolution. Because as we've opened this program, we want to think that we have a president making these decisions. But now you have corporations, multinational corporations, that want to privatize the court system. That's what's happening, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And they're using these treaties to do that. Now, you know what this is about? This has nothing to do with free trade. It has to do with them trying to deregulate. They want to do away with safety and health and environmental issues. They want to say those things are unimportant, and if we say they're unimportant, there's going to be no court that says they're going to step in and make sure that we toe the line. Corporations are trying to privatize the judicial process all over the world by using these free trade agreements. And this investor state resolution that Obama is supporting, both feet behind him, this is part of it, isn't it?
There's no question. As a matter of fact, not only are we talking about privatize, but they want to dominate and do away, deregulate is another key phrase here. They want to deregulate every regulation that consumers have in this country to protect themselves. Not only here, you have emerging nations, China, Brazil, India, who are trying to set up a rule of law government with regulations that protect the consumers. They see this coming and they want to stop it. They want to stop it by setting up a world court, if you will, under the guise of free trade, to use your phrase, what is it, investor nation resolution, which is all a buzzword for we're not going to live by your regulations. For example, California, we don't care if you have offshore drilling regulations to keep our beaches and environment clean. We're going to go drill because the world court says we can drill in any ocean.
Joe, apparently there's no way to reverse this. This president doesn't seem willing to do that. Joe Cotchett, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.